shortened version of our normal show because it's Wednesday, which means it's family dinner night. Um, and I try to wrap it up early. And it just so happens today is a topic of conversation, part 7, that we're all very, very familiar with. However, there are a couple of interesting twists from the authors, and it's about the World Anti-Communist League. And obviously, I am so happy that we were able to figure out what the heck that was and do a deep dive into it because, as you guys know, it just keeps coming up because it's an integral part of Operation Gladio. And again, just another thing we stumbled over a couple of years ago. Oh my gosh, they just crashed the space. Holy moly. So let's go set it up again. And they did an update, which I updated. Oh my gosh. This is so frustrating. It crashed. All right, so let's set it up again. The kernels. Corner. Transnational anti-communism and Cold War. Part 7. Okay. All right, take 2. There's Bridget. SR71. And we can get going. Okay, so they already crashed it. It wouldn't let me do it 3 different times. And I did do the update. And after we got started, it crashed. Again, total white screen. So we'll see if we can get through the show today. So again, it will be an early show. The topic of conversation is the World Anti-Communist League. And thankfully, we know a lot about this topic because we discovered it a long time ago. And for everybody that's new, you remember that when we originally found this, we were thinking that it was basically kind of a shell, like a camouflage, in order to allow the Gladio entities to meet all around the world and pull in politicians and stuff like that. But through a lot of deep digging, we found out that it was much more than that. It is an integral part of the Gladio network and the terrorist training. They orchestrated actual schools as part of the World Anti-Communist League. It is actually very deep and very dark. There's an entire book written about it that we went over in several shows on the Alpha Warrior program. So this should go fast. Like I said, I've pre-read everything. I have it all marked up. I don't know if you guys can see. I've got everything lined up, ready to go. All right. So this author of this part of the book, remember, this is done in essays, so there's several different authors. Talks about that the origins of the World Anti-Communist League goes back to the Bolshevik Revolution. And that's weird because, so does the Stay Behind unit, Gladio, fascism, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it says up until the late 1970s, it was generally characterized as an extension of the European Nazi network. Now, I found that fascinating because that's the first time I've ever heard it referred to as an extension of the Nazi network. Not that we don't realize that by association, because again, Reinhard Gehlen created the Stay Behind units in Nazi Germany. It was that network that the CIA picked up and expanded, NATO picked up, CIA in the lead, and expanded it to all of the NATO nations. But for someone just out of the chute, the very first sentence of his essay is that it is generally characterized as an extension of European Nazi networks. Just was like astounding to me. He goes on to say that the sources for this characterization come from several different places, to include East European immigrants and West German BND, which is the CIA that Reinhard Gehlen ran, that supported the right-wing extremist, which is what the World Anti-Communist League was referred to as. In France, the information was recycled by Alain Guerin, Alain, last name Guerin, who was a communist journalist who became the main public source on the World Anti-Communist League. On the other hand, the Ukrainian immigrant networks in the US propagated their own histories of the World Anti-Communist League and other organizations. Also says that it had a headquarters in Paris. The League, which is interesting because originally that's where NATO was. But we know the actual headquarters was in Taiwan. And we had the Ri from Korea and the two war criminals from Japan that kind of set up the Asian People's Anti-Communist League, which then turned into the World Anti-Communist League. The League became an object of serious interest during the years of the strategy of tension in Italy, when investigative journalists began examining whether a transnational organization existed that was coordinating these fascist terrorist events. At the time, only two primary documents on the World Anti-Communist League had surfaced. One was a report by the head of the League's British chapter, Geoffrey Stuart Smith, who resigned in protest against the large influx of fascists into the World Anti-Communist League's European division. And we went over that when we did the series with Alpha, because he actually thought the organization was anti-communist. He didn't realize it was actually a Nazi organization. The other was a blue paper written by former members of the anti-Nazi resistance in Norway, which likewise denounced the fascist presence of Nazis. In London, the anti-fascist periodical Searchlight was also collecting material on their conferences, their activities, and what they didn't know at the time was that there was any activity outside of Europe. In the 1980s, the World Anti-Communist League's involvement in Nicaragua triggered the interest of investigators in the US. 1980s Nicaragua, the Iran-Contra, and the World Anti-Communist League was there. So, the only attempt at a complete study of the network was done by Inside the League, which is the book that I was using as the source document for the series with Alpha Warrior. That was written by John Lee Anderson and Scott Anderson, Their book concentrated on Central America and the role of the Latin American Anti-Communist League Confederation, referred to as CAL, CAL. But they also covered all of the background links, the Ukrainian immigrants. CAL's sponsorship of political violence was further exposed by Penny Lernoux, uh, Lernoux, Lernoux, who had been investigating the struggle between the Catholic Church and liberation theology in Latin America. Lernoux, who revealed the so-called Banzer Plan regarding the elimination of left-wing Catholics, a strategy adopted by the Third Conference of the CAL. Now, I have her book, and I'm about halfway through it. My own research, meaning the essay author, based at first in the archives of the Dominican order in Paris, led to a report by a missionary that revealed the extent to which the WACL was implicated in the violent repression of progressive Catholics across Latin America. In 1984, he began an investigation on the events in Central America for a French television company, which took him to the WACL conference in Dallas, Luxembourg, and Geneva. By the end of the decade, he had gathered hundreds of documents and interview transcripts to make a proper assessment of the League. Then in the late 80s, a Paraguayan political refugee, Martin Almada, offered to join my investigation, partly to assist his return to his country to support his case against the Paraguayan leader, Alfredo Stroessner, who was the dictator that was installed there. It was Almeida who, in December 1992, in the capital, discovered the so-called archives of horror. Now, if you guys remember, this was done like probably a year and a half ago when we were first discovering all of this. In Paraguay, there was a big, large room that was discovered that had, it was like floor to ceiling, this way and this way. And it was just humongous. And it was full of documents that talked about Operation Condor, everything about the operation down there, the disappearing of people, everything. So that's what he's referring to. The Paraguayan Ministry of Justice made the materials available to the author, and it was this source that seriously brought to light Operation Condor and the many links between state and private organizations in a transnational state terrorism network, including CAL, which is the Latin American part of the World Anti-Communist League. So far, only Patrice Mecheri has been able to transform these accounts from investigative journalism into an academic analysis, and much more needs to be done on revealing the content. On November 11th, 1918, he goes back to start talking about the anti-Bolshevikism. After the signing of the armistice that ended the First World War, a new kind of ideological war began. 17 nations and a multitude of armies and armed bands coalesced under a flag against the Bolshevik regime. In many ways, more of an extension of the First World War than a civil war. It involved the intervention by Western allies to overthrow the Bolshevik regime in order to protect their commercial, industrial, and financial interests and to defeat the communist threat, which again, you have to take with a grain of salt, because it is the people in New York and London that created the Bolshevik and funded it and then took advantage of it after it was done. Now, it could be, just stick this in the back of your brain, that they funded the Bolshevik Revolution basically so that they could steal all of the Tsar's gold. Because what they did after the Bolshevik Revolution is they went in and put railroads everywhere, electrified all of the territory that was under the Bolsheviks So they basically were financially benefiting because they got all of the concessions, contracts, and everything else for all of the resources in the former Russian Empire. Now, at some point, if they then want to set up a fascist government that they control, because what had happened is now Lenin's out of power, Trotsky was kicked out, so maybe they lost control. And that does happen in these scenarios. And so now they may legitimately be trying to get rid of it, but they may not. Because again, this is how they operate. So I only say that because I want everybody to keep an open mind when you read these things. What people's assessment of what's going on may or may not be true. And we have to keep an open mind, just like we did with the World Anti-Communist League. We made an initial assessment. It proved to be wrong. And so any of these hypotheses that we come up with as we're discovering what our real history is, they're all subject to change. And so you can't get wedded to one thing. And that's the biggest problem that I see with people who try to do historical research. They get wedded to one way of thinking, and they are not open to any other conversations about, well, what about this and what about this? Because it's not consistent with what you're saying happened. So just keep that in mind. There are several anti-communist groups that arose during this time. First was the Ukrainians, who had set out to regain their quote unquote lost independence of all of 2 weeks. And they became the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or OUN, a movement that for the next 70 years would plague the security services. And that entity is still there today, and it is still based on Nazis. The second was the Caucasian nationalists that were primarily Muslim, most rebellious of the people of the Russian Empire. And some of the members of this group lined up under the pan-Turkish banner. Third was, and it does say the ones that lined up under Turkish returned to the clandestine, created a clandestine opposition, because of course they did. Third is the nationalists from the Baltics and the Belarusia. All these groups operated separately from the White Russians, who only wanted a return to basically what Russia was, minus the Tsar. And they refused to recognize any of the border changes to the Russian Empire. The White Russians were therefore as much competitors as they were allies in the anti-Bolshevik cause. Following the defeat of the White Russians and the consolidation of Soviet control over Moscow, the Nationals looked for other allies. By the end of the 1930s, they had linked with German military intelligence. Outside help was needed to fight against the Bolsheviks. In the second half of the 1941, during the invasion of the Soviet Union, the German military intelligence organized the Ukrainian nationalists into units under German command. Now we know all about this because that was Reinhard Gehlen and Otto Skorzeny. They used regular troops and SS extermination battalions. The tactic was to open a pathway for the Weimar units that would be welcomed as liberators throughout the Ukrainian territory. Previously known as Limburg in the Austrian Empire, was kind of where Lvov is where they kind of focused. It was in the western part of Ukraine. These Ukrainian forces seized the opportunity to declare a free state of Ukraine And it lasted less than a week because you guys remember the story. They approached Bandera and Stetsko and all of them and said, hey, we're going to declare Ukraine their own state if you just help us do all of these horrible things. And of course, they were like, okay, sure, we'll help you. But then there was a competition between the leaders of the different segments so that they were extra cruel and extra horrible, evil, in the amount of people they killed because they were trying to make themselves look good in front of Hitler in order to be selected as the new person in charge of Ukraine. And so, as the Germans came through and quote unquote liberated that area, they immediately declared their independence, which Germany had no intentions of granting and basically swatted them down. So, they were quote unquote independent for all of a week. At the end of 1943, in a forest area in the western part of Ukraine, these same Ukrainian nationalists held the first clandestine Congress of the anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations. That was referred to as ABN, creating at the same time the Ukrainian National Army. These are the clandestine stay-behind units. This is what they're talking about. This is Gladio. These are the cells that Otto Skorzeny personally went there to train. The UPA then took part in attacks on the retreating Weimar while at the same time harassing the Red Army. They were basically fighting both because they were pissed off at Germany for not honoring the fact that they wanted to be their own country. And of course, they're pissed off at the Bolsheviks as well. So the UPA, consisting of about 70,000 guerrillas, were joined by fragments of the SS, Ukrainian, Belarus, Russian, and Cossack battalions, as well as Hungarian, Romania, Soviet, Baltic, and Georgian deserters. So, bunch of people. The Americans, British, and French began to take an interest in the UPA, especially when it became apparent that some of these units continued their struggle against the Soviet Union after 1945. This anti-communist guerrilla warfare, Gladio, went on for years, still today. The Ukrainians were undoubtedly the best organized and most dangerous threat to the Soviets. Stalin mobilized considerable force against the UPA, with Khrushchev playing a leading role, and forced the repatriation of millions on the border of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union in an effort to defeat them. The UPA was finally subdued in 1954, but its influence would continue with actors joining the World Anti-Communist League via the OUN. So in the 50s, the OUN and the ABN, the anti-Bolshevik nations, undertook a consistent and high-profile lobbying campaign in West Germany, i.e. Reinhard Gehlen, Canada, and we just found some Nazis in Canada recently, and the US, which is where Stetsko met Ronald Reagan in the White House, to secure exclusive representation in the international anti-Soviet immigration programs. In 1959, this also resulted in Congress passing a law 86 to 90, which designated the third week of July Captive Nations Week, which we talked about yesterday, which again pissed off the Soviet Union. The promotion of pseudo-nationalist causes that were based in minimum credibility, such as the alleged nation. Yeah, this was completely fake. They created a nation called Ideal Ural, and it's IDEL-Ural, like the Ural Mountains, for a race of people that didn't exist. So, that was included in the Captive Nations Week Yeah, we've got a captive nation that doesn't exist and it's got fictitious people in it. But it's very interesting because remember, if you go back to the Fabian Society, their whole pan-Europe, pan-Asia kind of concept was splitting Russia at the Ural Mountains. And I'm sure that has something to do with it. While Europe and Germany, they're like the same, but whatever, was treated as the prime site for the East-West power struggle, the hot wars were all being fought in the Pacific theater. China's civil war resulted in a communist victory. Indochina's war drug on, and then we had the outbreak of the Korean War. All of this seemed to herald an expansion of communist threats. Almost like that was its entire intended purpose. That and to install Chiang Kai-shek back into China, which, by the way, is the next comment. This fomented an even greater anti-communist movement, and it was led at the time by Chiang Kai-shek and his KMT military. And this author, strangely enough, says that Chiang Kai-shek was the former head of the Chinese state. He was not. Any claim that he had on that title was always contested because there was a huge, as they said, civil war going on at the time. We wanted him to be the Chinese head of state, but the Chinese people didn't because he was the drug king. He was drugging them all, selling opium, and the majority of the Chinese citizens did not want that to happen to their country. Unfortunately, that coalesced with Mao and not Chiang Kai-shek, which is how we ended up with Mao. Had Chiang Kai-shek not been selling drugs, that probably would have not happened. But, all right, following the loss of mainland China to Mao, CIA covert operations began to run out of Taiwan. No kidding. Chiang was supported by a thing called the China Lobby, which we've talked a lot about. A powerful network of congressmen, business interests that promoted the anti-communist struggle in Asia. Well, yeah, they touted that, but they really were just interested in maintaining the drug network. Chiang himself financed various anti-communist movements in Asia and was also assisted by Ukrainian members of the ABN, specialists in clandestine warfare, who were sent over by their American mentors. So, who knew that Ukrainian Gladio people are hanging out in Taiwan? So, they trained the secret police and covert action personnel and contributed to the creation of Radio Free Asia, i.e., the CIA, the Taiwanese equivalent of the Munich-based Radio Free Europe. In 1954, at the end of the Korean War, Chiang visited his Korean counterpart, Syngman Rhee, to discuss further collaboration. Communist victories in China and Indochina and insurgencies in Malaya, thanks to the Brits, and the Philippines, thanks to us, led a sense of urgency to the deliberations. Now, let me just say this. They refer to this as insurgencies, and I circled that word on purpose. There was no insurgency in Malaya, and there was no insurgency in the Philippines. That's horseshit. The Malaya people wanted the British out of their country. The Filipino people wanted America out of their country. Those were the nationalists that wanted their country free. So again, this play on words. They were not the insurgents. The insurgents were the foreign people, meaning us and the Brits in Malaya. Just keep that in mind. With the support of the China lobby and the CIA, Chiang and the Koreans created a new transnational organization called the Asian People's Anti-Communist League, which we know it was headquartered in Taiwan and was also part of the promotion of the quote unquote captive nation week, which for Taiwan's absolutely hilarious. They weren't even a real country. They were in Chinese island with a Chinese general on in charge of it that was installed by the CIA. This was particularly the case in the 1970s following the normalization of the China, meaning that it had all kinds of, created all kinds of turmoil. So it turns into the World Anti-Communist League. It enjoyed all kinds of support and money from the China lobby, the CIA, blah, blah, blah. The question of who the principal enemy actually was remained unsolved within the World Anti-Communist League because that was never the purpose. Taiwan pushed the case of the illegitimacy of the communist regime on mainland China during all of the lobby efforts of the China lobby. The development of a transnational anti-communist movement in Latin America continent was connected to all of the others. The anti-communism in Latin America had a broader purpose. It was being used to label state power against all subversive threats to quote unquote social order, such as trade unions, student movements, and radical elements of the church. And by radical elements of the church, they're just referring to liberation theology, which before it got bastardized and painted as a bad thing, literally was meant liberation from, like in Nicaragua and Guatemala, from United Fruit. They wanted liberation to not live basically as a colony, having all of their shit owned by foreigners. That's the whole purpose of it originally. But of course, it got dubbed a communist infiltration of the church and labeled as radical, because I guess in that point it was radical. Who doesn't want to be a colony? All right. Through the training received in U.S. military academies, the thought of national security was passed on to political and military elites throughout Latin America. There was a special emphasis on Brazilians. The East-West conflict was used to condemn all potential enemies of the state that was labeled as such by the intelligence services. It was also set in the context of quote unquote continental security. You know, we can't have another Fidel Castro anywhere. The hardline anti-communist organizations that emerged at the time was a group called the Anti-Communist Popular Front, which was created by Jorge Prieto, Prieto. His first name is Jorge, and I'm sorry, he has two last names. Prieto, and his other last name is Laurens. Lorenz came to prominence in 1954 as an organizer of the First American Congress, which was aimed at being anti-Soviet intervention in Latin America. It was held in May 1954 in Mexico City. Its main objective was to denounce the regime of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. And this is 1954. And remember, this is when we overthrow Guatemala. With the CIA backed coup against Arbenz less than a month away. So just before the CIA goes in and coups him, they have a Congress meeting saying that this is what we're going to do. And they want a condemnation issued by this group that they then use as propaganda to overthrow him. The Congress was used as a show of support for Colonel Castillo Armas, ARMAS. Declassified documents confirm the leading role of the CIA in the Congress. The follow-up events were held in Brazil in 1955 and Peru in 1956. The linkage between the Latin American Congress and the formation of the Asian People's Anti-Communist League, both occurred in 1954, point to a level of coordination of transnational anti-communism to create the entire entity. In 1955, following the Rio de Janeiro conferences, Dr. Ku Chin Kang, so Kuchen was the leader of the Asian People Anti-Communist League who attended the event and used the Asian People Anti-Communist League bulletin to call for a World Anti-Communist League to cement the bonds both in Latin America and Asia. Lorenz, increasingly active across Latin America, attempted to solidify the link with a World Anti-Communist Congress in Mexico City in 1958. He invited delegates from 5 continents. This initial ambitious attempt to unite all anti-communist factions failed. But that wouldn't be the end of it. Political activist Susan Labin, Labin, organized 2 important international conferences. The first, Political Warfare of the Soviets, was held in Paris in December 1960. The second, The Communist Threat to the World, was held in Rome in November 61. The list of participants was enlightening because in terms of the personnel involved, they basically were everyone that started the World Anti-Communist League. Labin also used the platforms to launch the idea of a world organization to consolidate separate regional networks. The 2 conferences signified a convergence of quote-unquote fighting anti-communism. In particular, the Soviet bloc immigrant groups around the ABN network with social democrat, Christian Democrat circles from Europe. And Labin herself had a background in the French social democrat networks. The Brazilian admiral Pena Botto, Botto, known for his anti-communist, which brought him to participate actively in the military coup by the CIA in 1964, attended the conference and was one of the leading representatives from Latin America. Then, lo and behold, we find the American Security Council, which we've talked about ad nauseum, which was created in 1955 to promote American peace and freedom. Sounds familiar? That's exactly what the Peace and Freedom organization that we were just talking about the last 2 days. They promote democracy and human rights. And in their wake, millions of people died. I'm not convinced at all they care about human rights. This is where the peace through strength came from. In 1962, Suzanne Labin published a long article in a paper called, or a bulletin called, Washington Report, which was a product of the American Security Council, entitled Cold War Education, Prerequisite to Victory. Having defined the weapons of political warfare waged by the enemy as propaganda, crypto-communist organizations, infiltration, activist cells, popular fronts, organized journey, attack on anti-communist, special schools, like the School of Americas, violent means, she asked the question, what can be done to counteract Soviet political warfare? She just described the CIA and the World Anti-Communist League and Gladio. But hey, enough about us. What about them? You just have to laugh. And what I find most amazing is her calling it political warfare. Because remember what is set up in Taipei, Taiwan, the political warfare cadre, right? That's the name of their school. Taking the and using terrorist organizations and calling them political parties in order to be able to run under the radar and say, if you attack me, you're attacking democracy. And she just happens to pick those exact same words. Not a coincidence. So she argued that it was in order to counter the Soviet propaganda from all of this shit, we had to create new organizations to build up political warfare capability. So we need a headquarters for political warfare that recommended countermeasures to the government. And it just so happens that was set up initially in Taiwan. And weirdly enough, it says that we needed schools to combat this, and they set up the school under the same name to do exactly that. We needed to train civil servants, military officers, and it would be necessary to create an international institution to coordinate all of the work. This institution would be called World League of Freedom, consisting of private organizations and working closely with the media under this transnational umbrella of academies for training political warfare experts. And it just so happens that's what the name of the school in Taiwan is. For Laban, the best allies in this endeavor would be representatives of people behind the Iron Curtain. Their desire for freedom is our best weapon of political warfare. The institutions would organize demonstrations, liberating legions on a voluntary basis, political commandos for later trouble spots, and above all, quote, the centers would be the most striking embodiment of the cardinal principle that we must abandon the purely defensive and take an offensive on the enemy's weakest front, the internal front, unquote. An example of a successful organization was identified as the Asian People's Anti-Communist League, which then laid the basis for the World Anti-Communist League and Operation Gladio, because that's what they're talking about. They're talking about inserting cells in order to foment revolution in these countries. The annual conference for the Asian People Anti-Communist League was in Seoul in 1966, and the decision to formally launch the World Anti-Communist League was taken. The first conference of the World Anti-Communist League happens the following year in 1967, in September and October. There was 170 representatives from 60 nations. That's a crap ton of people for a brand new organization. Okay. Belgian Marcel de Roover, Roover, was already a member of the anti-Bolshevik coalition. And on the whole, the European countries were underrepresented initially. The Asian representation was huge. thanks to the China lobby. Speaking of the China lobby, Marvin Liebman, Liebman, was there, who was from the China lobby. International organizations involved included the Asian Christian Anti-Communist Association, because we always have to bring religion into these movements. The Christian Anti-Communist Crusade, the European Freedom Council, which was an offshoot of the Ukrainian ABN, which was supported by their former boss, the German BND, Reinhard Gehlen. And the Inter-American Confederation of Continental Defense, that's a lot. Also, that kind of was a subset of the Latin American Congress. Susan Laban was also present. Soviet immigrants were presented by two organizations, the ABN, which was favored by the Taiwanese due to their interaction, long interaction, it says. Huh, who knew? And the Assembly of Captive European Nations, ASEAN, which we talked about yesterday, a more moderate organization with close ties to the Council of Europe. The ASEAN was also a creation of the CIA and BND. Wonder if they were selling crypto AG at these conferences. While the ABN joined the managing group of the World Anti-Communist League, ASEAN was pushed aside as an associate member. The large number of anti-Soviet Russians, particularly members of the NTS, in the ASEAN caused them to reject the leadership of Ukrainian OUN as part of their movement. Little squabbling back and forth. The World Anti-Communist League was organized around national and regional chapters. I guess what I find funny is even the Russian immigrants didn't want to recognize Ukraine as its own country, because it wasn't. It was managed by a board of directors in which were always Taiwanese. The board of directors, always Taiwanese. An annual assembly put together by a national or regional chapter provided a regular meeting place for its members, blah, blah, blah. The WACL held assemblies in Asia, particularly Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. And those are the ones that are the original founders. It was a major anti-communist manifestation, creating mass movements. They created 3 publications: the Asian Outlook, Replica, which was for Latin America, and ABN Correspondence, which was basically dedicated to the Ukrainians. The history of WACL can be divided into several periods, and they had splits within the organization. And since we've been through most of this, just a couple of highlights. You had, obviously, the Asian, you had the CAL, and in Mexico City in 1972, there were also new members that were even further fascist, which were directly linked to the death squads in South and Central America that were all members then of the World Anti-Communist League. You had Catholic fundamentalists from Argentina, Mexico, and Spain present at these meetings. And like the Opus Dei, those types of organizations were represented. They had representatives from various national intelligence agencies, internal security services, and military that went to these meetings. It became a major opportunity to link all of the organizations together. You had links between Europe and Latin America. And again, Europe had a lot of controversy over the people that were in it that thought they were really anti-communist and not fascist. And then when they found out how many Nazis were involved in the entire network, um, that created a big stir because it actually got a lot of publicity when that came out. The WACO continued into the 70s as the umbrella organization. The U.S. supported anti-communist movements with the American Security Council at its head, had ensured the League was as a whole, was oriented across the entire world with U.S. global interest in mind. The Taiwanese used the WACO and the Asian Pacific Anti-Communist League to try to undermine the U.S. dealings with mainland China during the Nixon administration. In 1975, Ku Chen King, who was the honorary chairman of WACO, issued a statement, quote, "The evil result of detente. This was a crucial moment, and our ardent hope is that the U.S. will stop taking any further steps towards the so-called normalization of relations with Chinese communists," unquote. The Taiwanese attempted to solidify their leadership of this transnational movement embedded in WACL by teaming up with Latin Americans and issuing a call for them all to unite against any reconciliation between the Soviet Union and the U.S. and mainland China and the U.S. Let's see. The promotion of WACL was leading to the promotion and coordination and cooperation among the anti-communists of various countries, doing everything possible to prevent any unity. Imagine that. Strategy of tension, anyone? The objective of many of the movements that made up WACL was the collapse of communism, both as a political system and ideology. The threat of subversion from within the free world was justified by advocating for armed struggle in response to communism. They viewed this as enabling the forces grouped under the WACL banner to oppose any form of political manifestation that did not accept their world view. In this way, all non-communist reform movements were rejected and attacked as stooges, so that you could not be non-aligned, you could not be independent, and any and all labor movements, student movements that did not conform to what they wanted was blasted as being basically communist, which is how you get the rhetoric in Chile and the Congo and all of those other places that they label them as communist in order to be able to attack them. So you can see behind the scenes all of this propaganda leading to exactly what the CIA wanted to have happen. The CAL, the anti-communist entity in Latin America, primarily Mexico, was officially born in 1972 during the National Assembly of WACL in Mexico City. Raimundo Guerrero, president of the Mexican Anti-Communist Federation, which was FEMACO, FEMACO, became the first chairman. FEMACO had appeared in 1967 as a front organization for the TICOS, which was the Catholic entity that was sponsored by the University of Guadalajara. And for those of you who've not watched the Alpha Warrior show, we went into this in depth, and that basically was funded by the CIA. This is where they had created the plan to attack liberation theology. It goes on to say Cal would gradually involve themselves in all of Latin America's domestic security forces, intelligence services, military, paramilitary, death squads, including using Cuban immigrants, Alpha 66, which is basically the CIA's guys, Mano Blanca of Guatemala, and the Orden of Salvador. It had two major objectives: fight against internal subversion to allow the armed forces to consolidate their power through national security states, basically fascism, and oppose the quote unquote Marxist church and anyone who was talking about liberation or nationalism in the church. Pope Paul VI was a particular political target, he being accused of playing into the hands of Marxism. Cal was also less visible, but an intricate member of WACL. Generally, its assemblies were held in two parts: a public event and a secret event, which coordinated the security services and the paramilitary events. The extensive secret transnational network known as Condor, Operation Condor, which began as a channel of an exchange of ideas of threats, but obviously ends up into full-fledged fascism, which coordinated the exchanges of prisoners, interrogations, and murders among the Latin American countries. The murder of Salvador Allende's former foreign secretary, Orlando Letelier, in Washington, D.C. in September 1976 was the first time brought into the public spotlight the Condor network. This operation had been subcontracted via Cal with the Argentine security services in charge of logistics. The death squads were their main tool of repression. However, the people that were part of the network that did the bomb that blew up Letelier and a U.S. American, his assistant, were from the Cuban exiles trained by the CIA. Out of the Cal meetings came a plan called the Banzer Plan, Banzer, to attack the church and its liberation theology supporters. Cal then sent a list of bishops who cooperated actively with international communism and anti-Christian subversion. The priests were incorporated into a hit plan that was going to be carried out by guerrilla insurgencies. They also were provided arms and money, like Gladio. Cal also demanded that they be excommunicated from the church. Various lists of individuals were sent to the Pope. Most of the people on those lists, they send them to the Pope to have them excommunicated. But most of everybody on that list ends up dead through the death squads. The culmination of this violence was the murder of Archbishop Oscar Romero of San Salvador in March 1980. During the 80s, spurred on by Reagan's hardline anti-communist rhetoric, the Republican Party in the U.S. began to take an even greater interest in WACL. They began attending meetings. Ronald Reagan wrote notes to be read at the WACL meetings. He was invited to attend, but he did send notes. The worldview of the anti-communist freedom fighters was dominated by propaganda by the CIA. In December 1979, the ongoing wars in Africa, in Sudan, Angola, Namibia, and Ogaden, that were seen as new front hot wars with executive authority to commit the U.S. to war being restricted to Congress following the Vietnam debacle, the principal channels for supporting the anti-communist forces around the globe became the CIA under William Casey. The Republican Party and its network of think tanks, financiers, and public intellectuals, such as the American Security Council, the Heritage Foundation, Western Goals, Accuracy in Media, that's laughable, National Strategy Information Center, the John Birch Society, Young Americans for Freedom, the National Review, Larry McDonald, Richard Viguerie, Louis Learman, Andy Messing, and billionaires such as the Hunt brothers and the Coors family all became funders of this effort. Wackel, especially under the leadership of General John Singleb, saw an influx of large number of anti-communist hawks from the U.S. military and former military personnel, such as the Belgian General Robert Close, the former deputy director of the NATO War School in Rome. Under Singleb's leadership, the activities of the ABN, the Asian People Anti-Communist League, and in particular Wackel, refocused to become part of the propaganda of the Reagan administration and their quote-unquote freedom fighters around the world. The 18th Annual Assembly was held in San Diego in 1984. The counteroffensive for world freedom was the label, that was their slogan for that meeting. The counteroffensive for world freedom. It was exactly the opposite. This was world fascism being implemented. Taking place only 1 month before the U.S. Senate would vote to ban all aid to the anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua, the leader of the Contras, Rodolfo Alero, was present among the representatives from 6 other anti-communist guerrilla movements from Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Angola, Mozambique, and Afghanistan. The Wackel became a direct channel for supporting all of these groups via finances and hardware. On the initiative of the North American chapter of Wackel, the Resistance National Mozambique, called RENAMO, placed an order for 50,000 uniforms, 500 surface-to-air missiles, 15,000 light weapons, enough ammunition for 30,000 men, 500 bazookas, and assorted rifles, portable 81 millimeter mortars, and heavy machine guns. This was done under a very shallow cover that RENAMO were only asking the World Anti-Communist League for information about all of these weapon systems, thereby staying within the letter of the U.S. law, because the League was only allowed to provide humanitarian aid. Of course, no one was deceived. Singlem later used the World Anti-Communist League banner to offer combat helicopters to the Contras, filling it, and he did so by filling it with medical supplies and called it humanitarian support. In May of 1985, as a follow-up to San Diego, an international meetup in Jamba, Angola, involving representatives from the guerrilla movements of Laos and Afghanistan. Now, remember, Angola is where we're fighting absolutely against the guys in the city that's educated and can run the country, and we're supporting the corrupt guy in UNITA that's related to the guy we installed in Congo after we killed Lumumba. Okay, just keep that straight. All during the Reagan administration. The purpose for these groups to sign an international agreement with Jonas Savimbi, Savimbi, the leader of UNITA. The meeting, initiated by Louis Learman, Lehrman, to consolidate an international anti-Soviet alliance, failed to produce anything substantial. According to Republican lobbyist Jack Abernoff, Learman read a letter Dana Warbacher, who was a Republican representative and supporter of the Afghan Mujahideen, i.e. CIA, had drafted on Reagan's behalf, expressing solidarity with these struggles against the quote unquote evil empire. The Time reporter, meaning CIA, on the scene, concluded that the meeting marked the beginning of a new lobby to urge Congress to support Nicaraguan Contras and every other anti communist guerrilla effort. At the same time, the 19th WACL Assembly happened in Dallas. An Afghan delegate made a request for ground to air missiles to attack Soviet helicopters. Give us missiles to destroy the Soviet helicopters, he said. The private network of WACL and the CIA would successfully provide Stinger missiles to the Afghan forces, which tipped the balance against the Soviet military. In this way, WACL became an instrument of a private war of the CIA to funnel illicit weapons all over the world. So that's basically it. I was flabbergasted that they had done such a great job of putting all of this research that we had done very concisely as an overview of everything. So let me just say one more thing. In his summary to this chapter, the Ukrainians and other immigrant groups took on an active political role in their homelands after the Soviet collapse. Franco Tuđman, a member of the Croatian chapter of WACL, became the president of post-Yugoslavia Croatia in 1990. Slava Stetsko, the widow of the former president of the pro-German Free Ukraine, the Weak, in 1942, and president of the ABN, went on to become vice president of the Ukrainian National Assembly. Her death in 2003 was a national mourning event. The Western Europe, where the WACL was never very important, its networks disappeared. In Latin America, the end of the dictatorship saw many of the Condor Cal networks arrested and put on trial, while others escaped and vanished, no doubt, in Western Europe and US. And it's interesting that they say it like there wasn't a whole lot of stuff happening in Western Europe, but they had their own Gladio program already full up and running. So they didn't necessarily need to coordinate with them because they had NATO filling in the gap. And there was enough group overlap for all of that to be reasonably cohesive. So one footnote I wanted to highlight, a former OSS Jedburgh during World War II in the late 1960s, Singlab was a field officer during the secret CIA operations in Tibet, which we know all about, the CIA bringing Tibetans into Colorado to train them to be terrorists, to attack China inside via Gladio, and was involved in the Phoenix program as head of the MAG-SOG Special Operations Group in Vietnam. In 1977, he was the chief of staff to U.S. forces in South Korea. He publicly criticized Carter's decision to withdraw U.S. troops from the Korean Peninsula because he, like Trump, wanted our military to come home. That's a bad thing. He was relieved of his duty and subsequently resigned from the military. He went on to co-found Western Goals Foundation. It was a conservative lobby group in 1979, followed by the U.S. Council for World Freedom, the U.S. chapter of WACL. So Singlab was instrumental in both WACL and the Western Goals, which was a CIA front. He was fully involved in the Iran-Contra affair as well. So just wanted to make sure I got that part in. So let's open it up. Ron, go ahead.
Sorry, hit the wrong button. I'm sitting here like I'm having to pick up my jaw off the desk. I never realized how dirty Reagan was. I have a couple. Well, let me make this point real quick. I was as you're doing this, I'm looking stuff up. I guess Pope Francis thought so highly of Romero that he canonized him as a saint in 2018.
Yeah.
Bet you didn't know that.
Mm-mm. No, I did. Yeah.
Oh, you did know that?
Yeah. Well, so what? I did a lot of research into all of these priests being killed in Latin America. It was dumbfounding to me. Again, so much of all of this is, like you just said, my jaw hit the ground. I'm like, but I was taught liberation theology is communist. Well, when you actually go back and you read some of the articles in Chile and Paraguay during that time, not now, all those people wanted was to be liberated from the oppressive foreign influence in their country. And the church, the Catholic Church, had taken up that effort. For example, when they tried to unionize in Chile, the Catholic Church was supporting the people in their quote unquote liberation from slave wages. So there was a completely different connotation to liberation theology than what we were brainwashed into believing here in the United States.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, and I've been doing a little bit of a deeper dive into the Sutton books, and one of the things that he said, which really I had never really given him much credence before, but he's like, during the early half of the between World War I and World War II, it's like they basically were trying to form three types of socialism. You had the Bolshevik socialism in Russia, the welfare socialism in the United States, and then the kind of the Hitlerian socialism in Europe. And I never really thought about that. And it's like, and it's all being pushed by the exact same forces.
Yes,
they're all the puppet strings. It's like, God, when have we ever had control of ourselves?
And I wouldn't. I mean, obviously he's a brainiac, but I take exception to the term socialism. It was all fascism.
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree with you.
Yeah. SR71, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel, and of course, thank everybody for attending, and all the folks out on Rumble. What I'm looking at, and everything we've just talked about today, the depth and the amount of people and nations involved is just staggering. And what else comes out of this is if looking at the WACL, all of this was by invite. None of it was open to the public. So that gives you an idea as to how far these people have dug in. And it just boggles my mind. Thank you, Colonel.
Sure. So just a comment over here, U.S. United States 1961 commented over on Rumble, Putin as a KGB agent was in Mozambique supporting its government against the CIA terrorists, good word, who were poisoning village water supplies and was responsible for heinous mass murder of civilians, like they did supporting the Contras in Nicaragua. I've read a little bit about that, so I know that to be true. And also he said before they were bombed, U.S. and Chilean intelligence operative Townley first came into the U.S. with sarin that was manufactured in Nazi Colony of Dignities compound, but didn't use it and returned. There's been a lot of talk about that as well. So you guys are awesome. Mager Sarge, 3 Days of the Condor book movie was about the CIA agent who discovers the rogue group cooing countries for oil resources. Yep. All right, Ron, go ahead.
I'm not trying to dominate. I've been doing a lot of research as you're talking here, and I want to read this little clip from it's just a summation of the thing with Arbenz, because whenever you say Arbenz, my immediate thought goes to Perkins, because he wrote significantly about Arbenz, in his book Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And I'll just read this kind of the paragraph summation. It says, discusses the 54 CIA-backed coup that overthrew Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz. Perkins presents this event as an early example of U.S. intervention aimed at protecting corporate interests, specifically those of United Fruit,
yep,
which felt threatened by Arbenz land reform policies. Yep. So, and obviously, I'm not going to go into what Perkins did, but that's another fantastic book. If you guys don't know about Economic Hitman, you need to read that book.
It's a very good book.
The thing that really puzzles me about him, though, is in his second book, he literally is either at the end of his first or in his second book, he says, I don't believe that there's a global conspiracy out there. And I'm thinking to myself, how in the hell can you be so involved and not see it? That just puzzles me.
All right. So this is kind of my, I don't know what, I come across this in every book. This book I'm reading, I leave it out in the overviews, but almost in every one of these essays, every one of these authors comes to that same conclusion as they describe the exact opposite. The book that we're going to do, Kevin Shipley's book, is it Ship? That the CIA guy, they tried to kill him, and he's still talking about, I'm not really sure about what's going on, kind of thing. And you'll see, because I will highlight it now that we've had this discussion, in some of his characterizations or his takeaways. And I'm like, you just want to, if you could, reach your hand through the book and shake the shit out of them, going, can't you see what's going on? But anyway,
exactly.
I know.
What is wrong with you?
I know. All along, go ahead.
Okay, Colonel, I was going to say something, but your most recent point just reminded me of something, which happens. You make it an interesting point, kind of, perhaps this is your point, about how certain writers are like, they go 358 on the circle and are like, then they kind of qualify the last 2 degrees of the circle. And sometimes you're like, why are they doing this? And I think, that can depend on different circumstances and different demographic groups. I'll give you an example. There's an article on the assassination of Malcolm X by a former Washington Post writer on the stunningly amazing site, kennedysandking.com. That's Jim DiEugenio's site. He's one of the folks who testified in front of the Luna committee hearings on the injuries to JFK. Okay, so he inserts a certain line in there, and I'm just going to I'm going to leave it in the bubble and maybe see if people want to agree or disagree with me on what that line is. Look, it's kind of what I call a please don't shoot me line. In other words, he's going about as far out there as you can go in the United States. And also, it can differ for different demographic groups, depending on the percentages of the electorate that they are marketed to impact. I didn't say that, they should impact them, because all humans should listen to other humans equally. But that's not the way knowledge is marketed in this country and in other countries, and we know that. So the other comment I wanted to make, I'm going to put that in the bubble. It's a article by a former Washington Post writer on the assassination of Malcolm X. I also wanted to just make a kind of comparative point, if I could, on a kind of, you mentioned El Salvador, and that's kind of in the news now. And, one of the things that I have been noticing, and for me, it's kind of, did a lot of work on El Salvador in the say mid to late 1980s. I mean, a lot of time. And it was one of those kind of issues that was sort of in the news at the time, because of Nicaragua and El Salvador, whatnot. As we just, you just pointed out why. Okay, so, but one of the things that's interesting in terms of the Democrats, around that time, you would get like maybe about 15% of the Democrats in the Senate sometimes saying the letters CIA, and it's like, meanwhile, in the alternative media, the alternative left media, which I, gradually came to realize was extremely controlled and quid pro quo, you would get a lot of talk about the CIA in Central America, but at this marketed with that, you would get extremely biased articles about JFK's foreign policy. What an interesting cocktail, and compared that with today, you get basically zero Democrats ever mentioning those three letters. And as a matter of fact, it's a 23-letter alphabet over here, because it's not on time, I guess. And also the so-called left, controlled left, foundation-funded left, as you know, the CIA called their compatible left, and we know what they were compatible with. There's virtually no talking about CIA ever. It's everything Zionism now. Everything. And God knows there should be a lot of talk about Zionism because they're committing a genocide, right? And it's kind of like, it's not marketed to all audiences equally over here. And yet, there's zero discussion at all about the CIA peripherals on that, without which there's no Zionist genocide whatsoever. For example, what the CIA did with Egypt and Saudi Arabia as a direct result of that dogleg turn in Dallas, Texas.
Right.
So, in other words, you can see these relationships change over time, and you can see the growing power of the unchecked institution as you compare it over time. And that's kind of really important to do, to not just look at things like, okay, what was happening at that moment, but how does that contrast over time? And that's where you can, in my opinion, really see
that's true.
The growth of the invisibilized hand called the Central Intelligence Agency.
I agree. All right, we got 8 minutes. Carrie, go.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that John Perkins, when they heard tell that he was writing his first book, he had a little visit, and he told him to fuck off. So who knows what they said to him. I think they got to read it between the lines kind of thing. That's my take on all these people.
Right.
Because, they'll kill him without even blinking.
Yep. I agree with that. Miles, go ahead.
Hi, Colonel. It seems like we're in a new paradigm, and I don't know when it started and how it started, but if we go back to what you were talking about in Italy, where they had to have a secret underground court. So it seems like that was the old paradigm because you had to protect the witnesses and the whistleblowers. But now it seems like more and more is coming out where people are not going to be taken out. And I don't know if it's because we're overwhelming them with data and information and truth that they don't know who to take out. So do you see that we're in a new paradigm where people are actually going to not be afraid that they're going to be attacked?
Well, keep in mind what happened in Italy. The actual trials happened in 2019. The effort was about 7 years before that. So you're talking about the 2010 timeframe where the massive investigation went on. They have something very similar to sealed indictments. The facilities began being built, and then the actual revelation, the aftermath happened in 2019. There has been monumental things happen since 2019 as far as people waking up and being exposed to evil. And so, yes, I think we're in a new paradigm. People found out firsthand their government wants to kill them as a result of COVID. And I think that forced people to at least acknowledge it, even if they won't verbalize it. There's now a question mark in their head, and I think that literally changed everything as far as a mass awakening of evil. And I think that's kind of what's going on with the people that Tucker Carlson is interviewing, that Elon Musk is exposing, that Joe Rogan is exposing. There's just this slow, what I consider monotonous but necessary, rolling out of information, so that there's going to be a wave, a tidal wave, at some point where it becomes undeniable. Ron, go ahead.
I just want to say, it's, the fact that everybody's talking about Zionism and all that stuff is all well and good, but I question everything, and to me it just feels like it's too coordinated, it's too orchestrated, and it feels like there's something around the corner, some shoe's going to drop, and I don't know what that is. And if anybody has any postulations as to what they think that may be, or you, Colonel, I'm willing to entertain something. I categorically reject the whole notion that it's all the Jews. I think that's a cop out for people to really, go in and do some serious research. That's not to suggest that a large prominent section of these people, definitely, call themselves, members of Jewish members. But I think that I don't know. I'm just skeptical of this whole thing with this Zionism coming to the fore in such a large way right now, and everybody hopping on board, and it's almost like it's like a fad, if you will. And I'm curious to your thoughts on that.
Well, I've only got 3 minutes now, and so we can do that tomorrow. That's way too much.
That's good. Yeah,
yeah, that's way too much for 3 minutes. All along, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick response to Miles' comment about, why is nobody getting, I mean, maybe I misheard this, but it seemed to me a question about why are people not getting assassinated or bumped off. It's quite possible I misheard that. But I think, one of the more obvious reasons is that, the media has people kind of upstream divided at the level of media, so that with divisions so good and so professional by the CIA, utilizing confluence of both legacy media and controlled alternative media to kind of, even though like everyone's disagreeing with the Democrats and Republicans, if you look at the kind of organization and the synergy of alternative and big media, it kind of reinforces that those two basic scissor blades of Democrats and Republicans by parallelism. And you see this especially in the alternative left, how, yeah, they're not criticizing the Democrats as 100% CIA, and they're never mentioning CIA. But by only talking about Trump now, it kind of passively reinforces the false binary of the duopoly over here. And, in short, the propaganda is so great, they don't need to shoot anyone, although perhaps somebody could suggest some alternatives if they're sufficiently annoying.
Yeah. Okay. Stellar, go ahead. Stellar. All right. I don't know where Stellar went. Coyote, go ahead.
Hey, Colonel. I've had to rush over here, and I'm sorry I'm a little excited, but I got some news that only that you and everybody around here can understand without me seeming like a conspiracy theorist or
okay.
And it doesn't have anything to do with Israel. Nothing to do with Israel. I'm so sick of that. But anyway, so they just had a press release, like the white. All of a sudden, they just came out, and I've been seeing the MS-13, and we've seen the stuff going on in Argentina, right? And the big tariffs just dropped down. I've been looking for like a counter on China, right? And when they did this press release with the crying mother of a victim of an MS-13 gang member, and I thought all the MS-13 stuff was, a lot better, but it's got us looking over there to Argentina and El Salvador. It's like the Kansas City Shuffle, but they're shorting the dollar, like Soros style. And I have a buddy over at the Atlantic. He said something's going down in Europe even, but they don't know what it is really. The Chinese they're just doing some stuff. If I said it, nobody would get it, and I don't even really get it. But with some stuff with the money, and it's like why did they come out with the MS-13? Like, we got politicians that have done worse, and it's terrible what happened to our daughter and all that. But it does. They made a spectacle of it. So it seems like they're doing the not a false flag. I don't know what you would call this, but they're diverting our attention, and everybody is talking about El Salvador and MS-13 and all the stuff going on there, and it's driving me crazy.
And
Sorry.
what do you think they need to be talking about? The shorting of the dollar?
The counter to the tariffs. I think something's happening in China.
Okay. No doubt that whatever the mainstream media is covering isn't the real story. You're absolutely right about that. And so you always have to be, as a matter of fact, it's in that book about the Kevin Shipp's book about the purposeful seeding of narratives to take your focus away from what they don't want you to see. So you're absolutely right about keeping your eye open for looking around, not at what they're talking about, but at something else. So Coyote, dead on with that.
Last thing, Colonel, I've been talking to some other people. We need your help. The people don't accept, the programming and like I've been on the MI6 and to try to explain things. And when you do, it's like they throw little 100 emojis and then they go right back to talking about El Salvador, or whatever's going on. Like they're not understanding, but you have a different approach to things that I don't have. And a lot of people are asking questions about like being indoctrinated and all that. And I'd love if you would help me out. I'd love to explain this MI6 thing, because I think it'll get us away from the Jews, talk that's flooding everywhere around.
DM me. We'll figure it out.
I need direct access, Colonel. I need like 24/7. Like push a little button.
That's not going to happen, but you can DM me. We will chat. I promise that. But I'm not on anybody's beck and call, including my husband. So that ain't going to ever happen. All right. Anyway, I got to run, guys. Awesome. I love being here with you guys. I love sharing all of this information with you guys. Thank you so much for being here every day. You guys have no idea, because I'm like Coyote. I got to share this with somebody, and you guys are the bodies. So I understand, Coyote, exactly what you're saying, because it was Bridget, Cousin It, and I, and we were like, oh my God, we got to tell everybody this is crazy shit. So yes, I understand that feeling exactly. I feel it almost every day reading some passage of some book that I'm highlighting, and I can't wait to bring it to you guys. So anyway, God bless everybody. I will see you tomorrow, and I will be on Alpha Warrior Show tonight at 9:30. Just so you guys know, we are going to do the year in review. We are going to basically kind of do a summary of where all we've been and what we've learned. So it's going to be a really, really good show tonight. Promise you. So it may be something, Coyote, that you can use, because it's really going to take us full circle from where we've been, where we started off, what some of our assumptions were, and where we ended up. So God bless everybody. Tonight, 9:30 on Alpha Warrior Show, and then tomorrow here at 4. Take care. Okay, guys, I got to run. Take care.